I am Jack Murphy, and I was born in 1917 during the First World War. I don't remember that. But I had grown up I was born in Pennsylvania, and I grew up in Pennsylvania. And I had gone to school in John Harris High School in Harrisburg. And after leaving there, I spent a year in the CCC camp, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And times were hard, and so, but I had a paper route from the time I was 13 until for 3 years. And then after that, I had gone in, well, I was 20, in 1941, I was drafted into the Army. And I spent a year and a half there, and then I went into I transferred into the cadets, which was the old Army Air Corps. And after my pilot training, then I had gone to, I had all my pilot training in Texas. And then I was assigned to 19th Air Depot Group. And I didn't know it at the time, but they were processing them to go overseas. And so I had gone overseas in June of, we were married in cadets. Edith and I were married in cadets. She came down to Pennsylvania. We were married in a chapel down there. And then we went back here about 5 years ago with our families, went back to the chapel in Texas, and we renewed our vows there. That was our 50th anniversary. During the time that I was active in the service, I was first assigned to the Air Depot Group, where I was a test pilot. And I went overseas with them, and I spent a year in North Africa, and I was testing almost all of the aircraft before the time of jets, almost all of the aircraft that came through. They were bringing the aircraft through to take them to the front, and we would give them their final check rides and any repair and so forth. And I liked that job, but we were only married 9 months before I went overseas. And at the end of the year, I saw I wasn't going to get back home. And so I did what they always said not to do. I volunteered. I volunteered for combat. I'd taken a plane and went up into the combat group, B-17s, and I made my place up there, got my place. And then I came back up, and I had 35 missions, and some of them were rough, and some were not so rough. But I remember next to the last mission, I had a brand new B-17G, and we had two of them. I was the operations officer of the squadron, and so I got the new B-17, and we had flown over Munich, and we'd gone over Munich, and I brought that back with over 100 holes in the aircraft. My navigator was dead, and my bombardier was injured. And my navigator was a boy from my hometown. And then it was 6 days after that, which was my 35th mission, and I had flown. Now, I didn't know the crew. I was an itinerant pilot when I came into the group, so I was flying with different, I would have different crews flying with me. I didn't have a regular crew of my own. But I was the operations officer, and I was leading the squadron that day. And I had gone over, we were going over Linz, Austria, which was Hitler's hometown when he was a boy. And I remember we were going over there, and we had, I'd have my bombardier count the seconds to bombs away, and he had counted 1, 2, 3, up to 7. 7 was the last I heard. And suddenly it hit, and it just seemed everything went straight up in the air. And the controls were out, had no controls at all, no rudder, no aileron, no nothing. And so I had called for the boys to get out, but I imagine the communication system was shut out too. And so then the plane had gone long a ways, and it had rolled one time. I had my belt fastened, and I loosened my belt, I looked over and I could see my co-pilot was there with his head over and slumped over, and I would assume that he was dead from the flak. The flak hit right either in the bomb bay or just underneath the aircraft at the bomb bay, because it raised it right straight up. It didn't go off on a wing when it exploded. And then, then I unhooked my safety belt, and then it had rolled the second time, and then I was thrown to the top of the cockpit. And then when it came back up again, I was dropped down. And when I dropped down into the escape, down into the navigator's compartment. And when I was in the navigator's compartment, it must have started to spin, because I was thrown up against the fuselage at the wing, and I couldn't pull myself out of there. And I prayed, Lord help me, because I figured I was going to my death. And I no more than got that out of my mouth, I heard something like a giant sheet ripping. And that was the rivets popping out of the wings. And I was asking the Lord to get me to that escape hatch over there. But instead of that, he tore it apart, and the whole wing came off, and I was out in the open, free. And sitting there, it was a glorious feeling when I looked up and I could see that white parachute unfurl as it was above, compared to what I was going through before that. I was impressed with the amount of the lack of noise. Inside, everything was roaring and tearing apart. But when I got outside, everything was dead quiet. And then other than they were shooting at me, I came down right close to an aircraft battery. And they were shooting at me. I heard one bullet whistle by. And I came down. And the ground came up fairly fast. I was flying at 22, we were flying over 22,000 feet that day. And the ground came up fast. And so I had landed, and when I hit, the only thing I had wrong after I got on my feet, I had a little scratch on my finger here, from my own fingernail, apparently from the snap when my chute opened. And the glorious thing, and I praise the Lord for that. And one thing it did, it brought me a lot closer to my Lord than I ever was before. After this, I stayed in the service after I got home for 2 years. And then I had gotten out, and I had a delay en route. And when I went home, my father offered me a partnership in the business that he was starting back into after the war. And so I had gone into business, and we were building roads and bridges then. And then after that, we had several businesses. One was selling and building some pre-cut homes. And after that, then we started a home center, and we still have the home center. We've had it for 20-some years now, and we still have the home center. I'm not very active in it. We have a manager, but we still own the store. It has been a glorious experience. One of the nicest experiences that I've had really is these meetings together, where we can get together and renew. You know, it's a very unique thing that we can go through some 60 years and have a friendship that lasts that long with so many people. And the year that I spent almost a year in prison camp, and of course we were real closely knit while we were there, because that was a 24-hour-a-day thing. And so we got to know one another quite well. And it is real nice to be able to sit again and to have the reunions with those people in this. After I had hit the ground, I noticed I started to walk, and there was one flying boot missing. And there was a little woods. I landed in a field right close to a woods. And at first, I had gotten down in the field. I'd taken my parachute and my one boot in, and I had buried it inside the woods. I figured it was better to be in the rye field. And the rye was 25th of July, and the rye was quite high, and I had crawled out into that. But as it went on, the mosquitoes and flies were so bad that I figured I would be better off in the woods. But before I had a chance to, I was free about an hour and a half. And I didn't know that anyone had seen me there, but I could hear way up in the upper end of the field, I could hear voices. And as these voices were coming closer, I couldn't understand what they were saying. But as they were coming closer, I could tell they were excited. And I knew that there were several people there at least. And so as they came down, and when they got closer, I hear the one say in English, he said, "Last time American come out." And when I came up, and there were 5 of them all the way right around me, some had shotguns and some had rifles. There was a middle-aged man there, and there was one boy about 17 there. And so they were walking me in, and there were several of them ahead of me, and one right ahead of me, and several in back. Well, here I looked on the kid's belt, and he had a boot, a flying boot hanging there. And here I looked, and it was my initials on that flying boot. So the flying boot apparently had been jerked off when the chute opened. When the chute with the snap was there, it must have pulled the flying boot off. I was taken then over to, there was a truck there, and they were scouring the fields for other people that were down, some of my crew and some other. And I never thought I'd be shot down. I just didn't think that was in my future. And so I didn't have my dog tags on. And so they had a Gestapo agent that came along. The soldier that had got me there, he asked for my dog tags, and I pretended at first I didn't know what he was talking about. But as the Gestapo agent came along, and he pulled out one of the soldiers' dog tags, and he was showing me what he wanted. And I said, you know, I just motioned that I didn't have them. He pointed his finger around his neck and looked up the tree, you know, and so they could hang me if I didn't have my dog tags. Well, anyhow, they didn't hang me. And then I was taken from there in that truck, and we went over several from the group here, and we went over, and they took us up into a concentration camp. Now, this was one of Hitler's first concentration camps that he had built. And so we were there for several days, and while we were sitting outside, they wouldn't take us inside because the commander wasn't there, and they couldn't take us inside without that. So they kept us outside, and while we were there, they brought people in that had been injured in a quarry explosion. And I didn't know this where they were from at the time, but anyhow, there were 5 of them that were injured, and one was dead. And they took and laid him over along the fence. There was a stone fence there, and they laid him over there, and this wasn't any more than maybe 50 feet away from us. And after all we'd been through that day, here's this corpse that is over there, and they come out and look at his arm. One would pull the blanket down, the other would pull it back up, you know, and then someone would come out and they'd look again at the tattoo that they have on their arm. These were, I believe they were Polish people. Several of the people had gone into the basement where they had, I understand they had the infirmary, and they were injured and they had gone down there, and then several of them had been crying too on account of the man because he was dead. Anyhow, they took us from there then into the interrogation camp in, I forget the name of the place, but anyhow, we were at the interrogation center for 2 days, and then they had taken us. I didn't give them any information at all. I gave them my name, rank, and serial number, and nothing else. And so they only had me in 2 times, and they would kind of try to butter you up with cigarettes and milk or whatever they had there. And they would try, and it was amusing when the one was interrogating me. They were speaking English. When they were interrogating me, the one said, well, when I would tell him what it was, he said, well, you might as well tell me, because he said, this is your group. And he was pointing to a B-24 group. Before when we first came in, and before they took us into interrogation, they had 4 young fellows there who were gunners, enlisted men. And so they said, don't forget, before they went into interrogation, they said, don't forget, they didn't have any of their officers with them. They said, don't forget, Lieutenant Murphy. They said, we were with you. So apparently they were from B-24s, and apparently they had gone in and they told him that. So when the interrogator had me in, well, he had me in B-24s too, and I was a B-17 pilot. But anyway, after the interrogation, then they took us up into Dulag, which was a transit center, and then after that they had taken us up into the camp where we finally landed. One thing I remember very plain when we were going through the station, when they were taking us to the train through the station from the interrogation center, hanging in the station they had 6 British and American soldiers. I know some of them were Air Force, I don't know whether, but they had them hanging there. Of course, the Germans, you know, were real upset and disturbed because we had been hitting their cities. We weren't hitting their cities as bad, but the English were. And then, of course, they were cross at us because, which I guess you can't blame them for. But they would, when the people were en route, you know, the civilians would take them away from the soldiers, and they would hang them up. The experience in camp, a lot of time people would ask you, you know, well, wasn't that awful in camp? actually it wasn't awful in camp. You know, we did have very little contact with the Germans at all. About the only Germans we saw there were the German guards, and they were not to be feared, really.
Could you tell a story about the guy that didn't want to fly that you flew with, that you had to fly with you?
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I think it's important.
When I was flying, there was a man there who I knew fairly well, and I was assigning the crews, the pilots, to the aircraft, and so I had assigned him to fly as the pilot in one of the B-17s, and he said, I can't do that. Now, he was flying what was supposed to be his 50th mission the second time then. He flew 50 missions first, and then he found out there was a mistake in his record. And so then he had to fly that 50th mission the second time. So there was a lot of superstition about that 50th mission. Well, anyhow, he came to me, and he said, and he said, well, I can't do that, and he was in tears. And I said, well, you've got to do that or you can't get home. I said, they're not going to leave you go home unless you fly the 50 mission. Anyhow, finally, and I told him he'd have to fly. And finally he said, how about if I fly with you as your co-pilot? And so I saw the situation that he was in, the mental situation he was in, and he flew with me. And that day when he was flying with me, as soon as he got up where he could see the burst of flak off in a distance, why he would grab his flak vest and pull his vest down and hang on to the side of the aircraft and grab. And I was really afraid that it was going to grab the controls, something that would have interfered with that. But when you look back on this, it was really foolish to ever have a man like that flying as your co-pilot. If anything happened to me, he would have been in bad shape. And he really could have caused things to happen that weren't there. This was pitiful, and I saw several other boys that were there as they got close to the end of their missions that they had gotten pretty well mentally disturbed. It's a sorry thing when you look at what the war does to people, because those people would be affected probably for the rest of their life. As I said previously, we were married in Texas, and we always wanted a boy and girl. We talked about that. I had gone with Mrs. Murphy for 4 years before we married, maybe 5. And we always wanted a girl and a boy first, and then the girl. And you know, that's just the way that we had gotten them. I have the boy with me today and his wife. And so it pretty well was the answer to prayer that we had there. And I think it's pitiful sometimes when you do see, I wear a hat which has World War II, on. I get a lot of results from that. I have people come up and grab my hand and shake my hand. I had a fellow here on this trip. I had a fellow the other day, and he shook my hand once, and then he asked me where I was, and I told him I had been in Africa. And again, he grabbed my hand, he shook my hand, and then he asked me where the other place had been, and then I said, I was flying, and I was shot down my 35th mission. And I spent a year with Germany. The third time he came over and he said, I had a father who was in the Second World War. And so I think that you see a lot of this today. I don't think that anyone should ever forget the war that was there, because it was a horrible thing. And you see, we were fortunate in the Air Force. We fought a gentleman's war in the Air Force. I didn't have to see people die that I was responsible for and do things like this. And I always felt well about that, because I hunt a lot. I'm pretty proficient with a gun, and so I hate to think that I would use that gun, to kill a man. So I was always glad for that. As far as I was concerned personally, I never thought that anything would happen to me like the thing had happened. And I relied a lot on the Lord. I knew the Lord. I was saved when I was a young fellow. But this really brought me closer than anything that I had ever done that brought me that much closer to this. But when I see the way the young folks do today, and I see the things that you see take place in everyday life, which our children and our grandchildren have to live through, is rather pitiful. And the way the young folks are going with the freedoms that they take with everything, it's not just a matter of sex. The drugs is a great deal worse today than ever before. I don't know, even the alcohol and the other things is worse today than it was back at the time that we were young. And I hate to think of what will happen if it continues on with the liberties that our young folks have, and they're faced with a lot more things today than we ever were when we were that age. And so I would hate to see this, and I would pray that we can some way get to those young folks so that they can be brought to the Lord. I'll tell you from my own future, I have all my faith in Jesus Christ, and I'm certain when I die, my spirit is going to go with him. So when I look at death, this is an entirely different matter. When you don't know what's going to happen to you, or if you're not going to join him, then think back and think what would happen to you at the time that you die.
The chestnut trees, the wishing well, I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing